right, everyone, welcome to the Stoa. I am the steward of the Stoa, Aaron Rogerson. Peter is in Europe. It is very late his time, so he's recruited me to host this event for him. Today we have Raven Connolly with us. Many of you already know Raven, but for those who don't, Raven is a student of romantic relationships. She is a matchmaker. She runs a series on sex and culture at Rebel Wisdom, and soon we'll be launching a course that will dive deeper into the subjects of love and relating in the modern world. Today, she's here to discuss sex, dating, why modern relationships are so fucked up, and how to unfuck them. Q&A will follow Raven's presentation. So if you have any questions for Raven, throw them in the chat and I will call on you to answer them during the Q&A portion of this session. If you would like me to read your question for Raven for you, just state that in the chat. And after Q&A, we're going to shift to Socratic Speed Dating, which we will explain later, but you should stay for that because it's interesting. And then Raven, take it away.
Hi, everybody. My name is Raven. I'm really excited to be here today, to be kind of put on the spot to talk about relationality and relationships, love and desire, gender and sex in the modern context, in the modern world. I'm super happy that everyone's come to join me today. I'm going to do a little PowerPoint presentation. It's pretty simple. It's simple, but it will help guide me through the conceptual complexities that we're presented with when we want to try and have a deep conversation about relationships and modernity. So I'll show you all, share my screen, and we'll get started with that. Okay. Share my screen and present. Okay. Why modern relationships are so fucked up and how to unfuck them. You might feel the signature of the steward in this title, that kind of thumos energy that Peter likes to bring to these conversations. So I kind of adopted this frame. I thought it was a really great way of getting into this conversation. Modern relationships brings up some questions about, okay, well, what is modernity? What kind of relationships are we talking about? And fucked or not fucked is some sort of value judgment, right? So how are we talking about what is good and what is bad within the relational sphere? So that's where we're gonna kind of start today, is talking about modernity. So this is something that I borrowed from Christopher Alexander. There's a lot of work out there on deconstructing modernity. Huge philosophical, works, decades of investigation to try and get out of the mess that modernity kind of presents us with. So these are some of the ideas that I thought were most relevant to the conversation that we're having today, that come from Christopher Alexander, the architect. So these ideas, these kind of tacit assumptions of modernity, what are they? So what is true is only the body of those facts which can be represented as lifeless mechanisms. Matters of value are subjective. Modern conceptions of human liberty require that all values be viewed as subjective. And the subjective nature of value gives the private striving of each individual person, even when vacuous or image-inspired or greed-inspired, the same weight. Attempts to put value on an objective footing are to be viewed with suspicion. The basic matter of the world is inert, and matter and mind, the objective outer world and the subjective inner world, are taken to be two entirely different roots. So these are some of the ideas, the tacit assumptions nested within modernity. And we can see this through the language of economics, of scientific materialism, of individualism, and a progressive view of history that's rooted in technological progress. And this language itself constrains our ability to see and to understand some very alive aspects of our world, right? So one of these things that I'm going to focus on a lot in this conversation is the economic framing of reality. Economic language is very insidious in terms of speaking of the relational. Even when we're trying to get out of the frame of modernity, economic language slips in. We're like, oh, the cost of something, or the trade-offs of certain decisions, or the value of a person, time preference. These are all economic ideas. And the reason why is because economics is a pretty good language for kind of brutally cutting through the complexity of the relational sphere. But it also gives us other kinds of assumptions that we have to confront. Like, for example, paying somebody to do something because they're willing to do it for money, in my opinion, and I think we're going to argue this, is not a good enough justification for what ought to be done, what ought to be protected, and what ought to be sacrificed. So modernism has kind of put us in this relational situation through all of these different ways that we justify behavior, through pricing, for example. That if I can find someone who will do something depraved for a certain amount of money, then it's a legitimate thing. It has no moral weight because there's someone out there who's willing to do it. That type of thinking. And many of the other types of justifications, the subjective nature of value, means that even someone who's motivated by greed or through competition or through some kind of antisocial behavior is still entitled to the thing that they're trying to achieve, because all value is subjective. So this is like a kind of explosive relational situation. It's a moral situation that is highly complex, not to mention we have 8 billion people on the planet. We have 4 billion people on the internet. The possible combinations of relationships has just exploded, even in my lifetime. And yet modernism itself does not give us the language or the conceptual footing to even begin to resolve these conflicts, to even explain them, not to mention govern them and lead us out of this situation that we're in. I consider this to be the postmodern condition. Like, this is what postmodernity means to me, is modernity itself has kind of outpaced its implications. We're living in its shadow. All the things that can't be understood by the frameworks of modernity are now these like omnipresent forces in our realities. And we feel the anxiety of this and we want to resolve it, but how? How can we get out of this mess? So one of the things that I've been focusing on primarily is the theory of man, right? So who is the human being, right? Homo economicus as this rational individual operating within an environment of scarcity, trying to achieve a position in competition with others isn't a good enough explanation of the human being. Man as a relational, moral, and embodied creature is in the ontological shadow cast by modernity. What this means is the moral existence of human beings is completely discounted as how our behavior changes. Within the economic paradigm, it doesn't make sense, the idea that people could be morally motivated to improve their behavior when it's not rationally an economic choice for them, which kind of puts us in a terrible situation when we think about trying to resolve gender conflict, racial conflict, the conflict between the poor and the wealthy, climate change, all of these things. If there's no moral framework, if there's no moral person, we don't live that way, then how do we even incentivize behavior? How do we change the way that we're behaving so that we can all live together harmoniously? Thankfully, this is not true. Thankfully, we are not rational economic beings that have to basically be paid to do things in order for them to get done. That isn't the only thing that we use to motivate ourselves. In fact, we are sensing beings. And through our sensing, we can experience relational dynamics, which in turn create our generative morality. So relationality and morality, in my eyes, are interconnected. In relationships, we create the relational problems that we have, which in turns develops our moral and relational intuitions. So I'm taking this concept of the problem kind of creating the opportunity for moral growth or the growth of consciousness from Kegan's work on adult development, where each stage of development presents a kind of complex set of relational problems that the subject involved in these things has to actually transcend to a new order of consciousness in order to make sense of and resolve. And that these are inherently relational problems, that our consciousness is actually embedded in our sociality. The fact that we are in relationship in so many different ways to so many different people. And that these things sometimes come into conflict. Sometimes you have to choose, who are you the most loyal to? Is it your partner or is it your child? Is it your job, your career, or your parents? Sometimes these things come into conflict. And what do you choose as part of your development and your moral character? So this idea that we're embedded in a generative morality is where the kind of emergence of character occurs. So there's this larger space where our norms are kind of generating the dynamics of our behavior. And that's an example or an effect of our personal developments of character throughout our lives. Which brings us into embodiment. Embodiment is a very hot term in these spaces, and I think there's a really powerful reason why. Embodiment, and not in a trivial way of a hedonism where we just listen to the desires of the body, but a true development of the sensing parts of who we are, actually gives us a deeper sense of our interrelationships, our dynamics with other conscious beings. When we're more embodied, when we bring our consciousness into the entirety of our body, where there's no distinction between the mind and the body, and we're living as felt sense dynamic beings, we can actually involve ourselves with others in a much deeper capacity. So in this sense, embodiment and relationality are inherently intertwined. And through embodiment, we begin to feel ourselves as sensing beings. Not only that, but we develop our specialized senses. We as humans, we have specialized senses for understanding others, other conscious beings. And we've been cutting ourselves off from them within the context of modernity. We're not able to use those sensing tools to explain the things in reality. You know, this is where it becomes a philosophical, conceptual problem as well. It means that we can't actually perceive or bring language to our perceptions of other conscious beings. We have senses made for feeling others inside us, and we can feel what someone else is feeling. We can think what someone else is thinking. Opening the body into its sensing capacity is opening experience into relationality. Therefore, others are no longer intellectual constructs, but felt sense dynamic beings. So that's where I think we are. We're embodied creatures. We're moral creatures. We're relational creatures. And we have so much capacity to develop these senses. But we're still within this context of modernity. So let's kind of look back into the history of this. So we're bodies, right? And there are two genders. They're males and females. They're men and women. So when there was the big economic, political, financial, technological, and environmental changes that came with modernity, this also impacted the way that men and women were living together. And my understanding of this is pretty rooted in the Anglosphere. We're obviously having this conversation in English, and I come from this kind of Anglo-centric perspective, and I think that's an important thing to recognize. But also, it was England that was the birth of a lot of the modern constructs that we have today and that are spreading. So the rise of women's rights in England is kind of like a particular point in history. There was this confluence of multiple different kinds of things that allowed for the technological and economic transitions that were happening at the time, which was basically the growth of the merchant class and this development of new wealth and status, to also be reflected in gender dynamics, to the point where women who had been segregated, the male and female dynamics had been gendered in almost in all instances of any civilization ever. Suddenly women were trying to find themselves within the hierarchies of men, within the visibility of male dominated environments. And a lot of this was basically circumstantial. The domain of women, the domestic sphere, basically became smaller and smaller and smaller in terms of its importance and its influence over the social dynamics at play during industrialization. And women were frozen out of all of these influential positions and were losing power. And so they advocated for legibility within the context of an economic and legal system for which previously had only been dominated by men. This changed so much. This was a really big shift that has had lots of different implications in terms of the way that we view women and then we view gender relations. So it brings up the question, and this is a perennial question, is how can men and women live together? Now, men and women are essentially seen from the vantage point of our economic and political system as essentially the same. We are sexed creatures, but basically equal. And the gender differences that we have don't really make much of a difference. From an economic perspective, women and men are expected to both go out and work in order to generate capital, to then contribute to the growth of the economy. And all of the things that had been the domain of women previously became kind of incidental conveniences, or, you know, the home or what you're doing with the children kind of got pushed to the side rather than being held as a kind of primary interest of how we were going to design our society. So I'm using these terms, I'm using gender and sex, and you know, these terms have an interesting history. It's obviously talking about gender and sex is a very hot button issue. Of course it is, right? It gets to the core of how we view ourselves and how we view others. And basically, I've just started reading Gender by Ivan Illich, and it's really been totally restructuring my way of thinking about sex and gender. So this is a quote from him, which is, "Gender is something other and much more than sex." So in this context, what does he mean? Well, sex is a scientific term. It actually means to cut. And science, which means severing, right, is basically taking something, gender, which is an interconnected kind of continuous negotiation between men and women for how they can live together, that changes minutely through a generative process into something that is distinct, categorical, with certain types of incidental characteristics. So in his view, actually the creation of sex basically destroyed or dismantled the existence of gender in our society. And the implications of this was to basically produce a sexist society, a society that could not actually see or acknowledge or give women the power of their own gender. So this idea really throws everything that we think kind of generally within our kind of conceptual environment about gender and sex totally topsy-turvy. And I think that's why I find it the most interesting. So his concept is broken gender. So this is the idea that coming into modernity, by replacing gender with sex, we basically broke this perennial concept that was organizing people. And what are the qualities of gender? So gender is an asymmetrical thing, making its resolution continuously elusive, inconclusive, and vulnerable to systemic threats. Meaning that this is a delicate balance that men and women find in their context. And when things become chaotic, this logic, this moral structure actually falls apart pretty easily. Gender as a concept has been severed by sex, and philosophical thought on the concept has been relegated to the shadows. It's very difficult to step outside of the prevailing paradigm around sex and gender without getting shot at. And that's really disabled our ability to really think deeply about how men and women can live together. The defense of gender using sex is inadequate and backs advocates of gender differences into a corner. This is an interesting idea. I mean, I've been basically falling into this myself, where I'm defending gender differences from the idea of sex differences and kind of building a conceptual structure rooted in the scientific literature that basically, confirms the idea that men and women are very different creatures. However, using this language of sex and of, secondary sex characteristics and organs and hormones, it basically doesn't protect the idea of gender at all. And instead, it just severs everything into these discrete parts. It doesn't give you any idea of like what ought to be the role of women or what ought to be the role of men in society. And it basically just leaves us with the same problem as before, except for we just have more descriptions of sex differences. It doesn't actually resolve the issue of men and women. Oh, I actually can't see the thing at the bottom. So you can enjoy that. I'll move on to the next thing. So a way in which I think that gender is being reconstructed, right, is through the language of feminine and masculine ways of knowing. So this is something that's pretty prevalent in like hippie circles and embodiment circles, kind of meta-modern ideas. And I think what I like about it is there is an acknowledgement of these different ways of being. There's the feminine and the masculine. These are gendered concepts, right? And the masculine typically is associated with explicit language, kind of explicit moral structures. It's associated with materials and direction. It's like of the phallus, right? This is the masculine way of knowing. The feminine way of knowing is all of these things that we've been mentioning in conversation: embodiment, relationality, ambiguity, implicitness, kind of these morally ambiguous, continuous processes. This has been the domain of the understanding of the feminine, this mercurial creature. And in, within the context of modernity, a lot of women, and this is part of the issue with women being brought into male hierarchies, instead of developing their feminine characteristics and their feminine embodiment, instead they had tried to teach themselves how to be masculine, how to be more male, in order to integrate into male hierarchies and to compete with men. So what is the effect of this? It means that men and women are competing for the same things, the same jobs, the same capital, the same prestige, which puts them at odds with one another. And it turns women, especially the best and the brightest and the most attractive and the most interesting, the most creative women who are trying to achieve in the world great things, it takes them and puts them into male hierarchies where they have to be a certain kind of way in order to survive, at the cost of developing their feminine wisdom. And what is that doing to our society, that women are not cultivating these things? I think that this is a big shadow, a big question of like the opportunity cost, of women not developing these things and them not being seen from the vantage point of the dominant systems that we live in as being at all important. Instead, they're incidental. So I mentioned before, the last slide, that because men and women are competing over the same resources in the same hierarchy, there's kind of a lot of competition between them. There's a lot of adversarial ideas. Of course, we have like, radical feminists coming after men. Then we have, male separatists, or whatever you want to call them, kind of, tossing out women as being holes or whatever you want to say. So there's like a lot of gender fighting in the culture wars, and there's a lot of conflict between men and women. And this, conflict between men and women is kind of a normal thing when we acknowledge that there are two different genders and that they're different. They perceive the world differently. They want different things from reality. They have different affordances. They have different capabilities. When we think of the world of humans, the relational world, as being gendered, we can begin to see that actually men and women are kind of two different cultures. And this is an idea that I've taken from Keegan and Esther Perel. Both of them are relational therapists, right? They're working with couples and families. And Esther Perel, she works across cultures as well. So her work spans, 9 languages, right? And what they talk about is the cultural differences between people in a couple. That a man and the woman who've been together for decades are still of 2 different cultures, even if they were raised in the same place at the same time, that there is a cross-cultural knowledge that can be developed between the genders that can bridge the gap between our differences. And that this is more important than ever because now our relationship expectations are incredible. I mean, our romantic relationships are burdened with all of these intense expectations, that somebody be your best friend, the best sex you've ever had in your life, an adventure buddy, a perfect father, developing their career, getting along with your family, all of these things that are kind of put on the monogamous pair bond as expectations that would make giving up the freedoms of our single lives worth it. A lot of pressure on the pair bond. And it's a unique arrangement. It's actually not very historically present. The male and the female, like living in a house together for most of their lives, even after they've raised children, is a pretty anomalous arrangement of society. So not only do we have this kind of unique circumstance of trying to bring men and women who are very different into the same house, into the same territory, to live together over the span of many decades, that in and of itself is a high expectation. To then expect that person to be everything for you adds all of these other layers of expectation and idealization that really challenge us. And I think in particular, challenge young people who are thinking about getting into relationships. The weight of that decision. How are you supposed to make that decision on a first, when you're 26, I'm 26, how are you supposed to make that decision when it weighs on you so heavily, right? So there's also a question of how we're treating each other. So thinking about, and I'm pretty much going to just talk about people who are looking to find long-term relationships because that's most of what I have direct experience with. And maybe one day I'll be able to talk about what it's like to be in a decade-long relationship. But as we know, and I could have done my presentation about this, the dating apps and fungibility and optionality and the essentially like the stratification of the sexual marketplace where there's like a very small amount of winners and a lot of losers. Like the dynamics that we have right now around sex and attention and relationships they're pretty bleak to acknowledge. And I mean, a lot of this is a lack of trust. It begets a lack of trust between men and women. And I think also a fear of intimacy and a fear of what true uncertainty comes with becoming close to someone else, right? The actual day-to-day experience of being in relationship is as a moral experience. It is a thing that drives your character development, that your embodied sensing of another. All of these things, these challenges that we talked about earlier in the presentation, become part of your dynamic with someone when you're forming a long-term pair bond. But when you're just going on a date here, a date there, you're not getting to that depth with someone. So they remain knowable to you within the context of the image that you have of them as an intellectual construct. There's something that I find about this that is very scary, that people are increasingly living this way, seeing one another as fungible and not even having a sense of energy around trying to overcome these differences. There's a kind of lethargy or resignation to this condition that I think we should be concerned about. We talked about this. So one of the main kind of dynamics to understand the dyad, the relational, is through this lens of love and desire. And what's interesting about this, I was reading a book called Can Love Last by Stephen Mitchell. And he's a great psychoanalyst, incredible writer. And one of the things that he twists in the story of love and desire that I found to be so interesting was he takes this idea of adventure, of love, you know, of like approaching someone from across the room and that initial kind of fire of infatuation, and contrasts it with the long-term relationship, you know, with the woman that you like feel a sense of love for and attachment to, but you know, really you kind of still have this desire for this like elusive femme fatale, right? So he takes this kind of dichotomy and he says that the one that looks adventurous, the femme fatale, the woman at a distance, is actually a secure relationship. That is a relationship of control, where nothing unpredictable is happening. And the person that you're in relationship with always stays at a safe enough distance that you never have to reveal yourself. And at home, when you're with the woman that you're attached to, with the woman who sees you, the woman who witnesses you, suddenly you're being seen, your shadow is being seen, the vulnerabilities of your experience, your subjectivity is being witnessed. These things make us feel incredibly vulnerable. And facing this continuous vulnerability of the witness, of someone watching you and making sure that you're living up to your own expectations, that you're not hiding things from yourself, that you're continuously confronting the shadow. This is very intimidating. And a lot of people don't want to engage in this kind of confrontation with the shadow. However, this is also one of our greatest opportunities. To be in relationship, to be in long-term relationship, to foster long-term pair bonds is an opportunity to develop embodiment and relationality and create an understanding between you and a person that you love about how to behave that is in alignment with all of these senses as you move through your life. Which is why I guess I feel like it's so sad that we're moving towards this more secure but also very superficial culture, because it's coming at such a cost to what is this like great potential of people developing this kind of relationality and this kind of embodiment through their pair bonds. So one of the things that I think could begin to bring forth more of this is the question of feminine virtue. Something I've talked to with Peter quite a lot, because an idea of masculine virtue is a pretty well-known idea. There's, you know, character development, there's stoicism, but an idea of like what a virtuous woman looks like, that it doesn't just kind of divide everything into like the Madonna and the whore, I don't think has really been conceptually developed. And I think that this is an opportunity for women, particularly women who are also going through these embodiment practices, to think about, okay, what is an authentic relationship with a person of the opposite gender? How can we come to negotiate it fairly, our dynamics in social space? How can I preserve my sense of integrity when, I mean, honestly, the situation with women is that women are highly desirable, and lots of men are competing for a small number of women. A woman in that situation has power that she can exploit. How does she overcome her position of power and do what is moral, what is right in terms of her treatment of men? So there's lots of different questions around this idea of feminine virtue, and I think just on a personal level, it's interesting to me because I've mostly tried to develop my character through Stoicism and other masculine conversations of virtue. And mostly this is just kind of bringing up this idea. I don't have any answers about it, just like I don't really have any strong answers about what a new gendered world would look like. I'm not sure. But I do think it's something to think about when moving about in the world, especially if you are a woman. So, okay, I'm gonna wrap up soon. I'm going a little bit over, but we're almost done. So why are we in relationships anyways? So this is something that's always so funny to me because we're talking about romantic relationships and there's so much fixation on like, the dyad, right? And when really, like, what are relationships for? They are in some level for having children, for bringing children into the world. This is often just kind of, once again, put to the side, kind of incidental, maybe something, probably not, you know. The question of having children has kind of been marginalized and even stigmatized in our kind of current conversations. But I think it's a really important thing to remember because it's much more continuous with our history to think about relationships as being the source of new life and of the future than to think of them as being just like romantic arrangements or kind of companionship within the context of a very atomized world. So thinking about children and thinking about family, I think, is actually much more of the primary unit of history and is also an opportunity for us to kind of expand our thinking when it comes to relationality. I think it's very hard for us as moderns to even really understand these complex relational dynamics outside of what we know. What do I know? I know myself as an individual. Maybe I know myself as a partner with someone else. Maybe I know myself in relation to my friends. But what happens when I'm in relationship to a child? Like everything shifts around, and I don't have children, but I can imagine, I can imagine the situation of being faced with your own child, and suddenly all of these new dimensions of relationality open up as an embodied experience. And this is a major threshold. Like, I think this is a huge change that happens in people's lives that cannot be simulated intellectually. It cannot be told. It's something that you go through as an initiation experience into another dimension of consciousness, of being. And that doesn't mean that everyone has to have children or that it's the only way of having meaning in the world, but you have to acknowledge, even if you're somebody who doesn't want to, that this is the source of life and the future, and that this is worth preserving and is important and sacred, regardless of whether or not you're contributing your own genetic material to the future. And these relationships of family are actually very hard to hold. It's a lot to take care of a dependent. It's a lot to take care of a lot of dependents. It requires a lot of resources and attention and capability. And now we have all of this moral weight on the act of having a child that we can't get it wrong. We have to have all the things. And our society continuously seems to be making structural choices or ideological choices that make it increasingly difficult. And this goes back to the idea of gender. That basically the domain of women, what women have kind of been the protectors of, which is this relationship with the future, has been entirely encroached. There's no space, there's no reverence. I mean, in the United States, we don't even have like federal, like maternal and paternity leave. Like this is how barbaric we are when we're thinking about our relationships with children. And it's totally missing from the picture in a lot of things. And so I want to bring it in. But also it's kind of beyond a lot of our thinking. It's beyond my thinking in the sense that I don't have children. I don't know how to think through this completely. But that is the origin of why men and women have ever tried to get together in the first place, even though they're so different. It's the babies. So that brings us into the generation of the future, right? I think if we're looking at modern societies, birth rates are declining. You can make a whole lists of kind of all the implications that developed nations seem to be facing with their population dynamics. But the people who figure these things out, who create relationships that can bring forth strong families and kind of bust through the shadow of modernity, I think, have a great opportunity to create a future that actually lives in relationship to these things. So, I mean, all of us here, I think either we can be participating in this future in a lot of different ways, through embodiment, through relationships, through finding the people that we love and connecting with them and revealing the shadow and developing our sense of morality with them. These are all things that I think can actually lead us to a generated moral structure that will allow us to get through the darkness, this liminal place that we are in post-modernity, to the other side. So I think that that's a path. I feel pretty convicted about it, and I'm living my life in service of this. So I guess we'll see. It's just a big experiment. And yeah, so that's my presentation. These are my influences. Ivan Illich, all these folks. And these will be people that I'll be pulling from for my course, which will basically be flushing out a lot of these ideas and providing readings and all of that. So I hope that was sufficiently provocative and also coherent. And I'm really looking forward to engaging with everybody and getting questions. No idea what's in the chat, so I'm looking forward to looking it over.
All right, thank you, Raven. Why don't we start with a question from Marco? If you're still with us, go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question.
Well, the question for Raven and everyone is the problem modernity or is it patriarchy? You know, sex has been fucked up ever since patriarchy started, so we can't really blame the problem on modernity. You know, if anything, modernity makes the matter worse because we can pretend that that we're free, whereas we're really not. And you know, there's an amazing book that I really strongly recommend. It's Erica Jong on Henry Miller that talks about this. So I guess the question is, what do you think is the role of patriarchy, and what is the relationship of modernity to patriarchy in your view?
Sure. When you say patriarchy, what do you mean? It's one of those terms.
Well, there's many definitions of it, but it's in my world, it's the overvaluing and the dominating of masculine beings and masculine values over feminine beings and feminine values, and the demonization of women and sexuality.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, we can work with that definition. Yeah, I mean, I think that that is definitely something that we see, and yeah, and is accentuated by modernity. Absolutely, there's a pre-existing kind of patriarchal arrangement of society, but I think, and I'm really kind of riffing on Ivan Illich's work in this domain, his book on gender, because basically what he did is he flipped this all over for me, because basically his idea is that yes, there's a patriarchal arrangement of traditional societies, with agriculture, with property moving through the male line, et cetera, but there's still these gender categories. So in a sense, we could think about gender as basically guilds. They are protected kind of ways of living, work, even language that was designated male, designated female. And that's meant that men were not going to encroach on the domains of life that women had dominion over. And women, of course, so that we know, were not allowed to have any presence in the domains of life that men had dominion over. And there's taboos kind of in the middle, keeping people from shifting from one gender to the other. So there was still this construction or this concept within societies of gender. And that with modernity, basically, we see the arrival of sex as an understanding of the difference between men and women. And basically, we throw out gender and these concepts over time, which the theory around the concept of the human of modernity is of a neuter, basically an asexual or a desexualized being with kind of incidental characteristics that show that they're of one sex or the other. And then this is what he says is actually sexist rather than patriarchal, that this is fundamentally sexist, because it isn't even acknowledging, you know, the gender distinctions between men and women, and basically expects women to compete in the hierarchies of men, in the domains of men, just like all men do. And basically leaves everything that had been designated part of the feminine gender totally in the shadow, totally encroached upon, totally left to be basically at the end of the production line. You know, how are you going to get your kids to school? Well, you'll just figure that out. You know, that's his concept, and that's the frame I'm working with right now. It's very new to me, so I wouldn't say that I'm like, you know, completely understanding of it in its entirety. But yeah, that's kind of my understanding right now.
Thank you, Marco. We're going to move on because we have a few questions here. I'm trying to finish before the top of the hour so we can move to Socratic Speed Dating. Let's go to Brandon, if you want to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Yes. I'm sorry, just a moment. Scroll up, make sure I read it correctly.
Mm-hmm.
All right, yes. Do you agree that meeting people through dating apps is inherently artificial and not really conducive to establishing fulfilling relationships? And if so, what alternatives could you recommend?
Mm-hmm. I think I would say that there is something pretty degrading about representing yourself within that medium as a way of finding people to have relationships with. I think there's a very, very, very small amount of people who kind of bust through that container and can somehow reach to the other side. Seems rare, but it seems like it is happening to some degree. If I could just push a button and get rid of all dating apps, would I? Like, yes, I absolutely would. An alternative, I mean, this really gets into, I think, some of the other stuff around trying to unpack gender, because there are a lot of ideas that we have about gender and approaching women and like how to do it and whether or not you can ask a woman on a date, like how to deal with all of these interpersonal things that come up when you're actually in an experience, an embodied experience with someone and you're talking to them. And I think a lot of people are being avoidant of the complexities of those situations and instead are going on dating apps because it's much more secure for them to do it. And this is a problem. I think it increases our security culture, this fear of the other or the uncertainty of social engagements. It's kind of reducing our overall kind of social understanding, relational understanding, which limits our capacity to kind of grow our culture and our communities. But it's pretty, I think, you know, it's a personal thing to go through the character development in order to confront the fear of talking to somebody at the grocery store. You know, or asking somebody how their day is going when you're waiting in line for a coffee, right? These are the kinds of things that I think, you know, the POA people, the pickup artists will say, you know, just talk to somebody in real life, and they have all these, you know, kind of manipulative tactics for how to do that. But, you know, as long as you don't take them too seriously, I think you can actually learn a lot from just how to engage with people, because fundamentally women want men who have game. This is just how it is. Like there's a lot of nerds out there who have a lot of good things to offer in terms of masculine ways of knowing. They know how to work machines, they know finance, they code, they can talk nerdy with their friends, they know about politics. They're very good at being men. Like I've met a lot of these guys, they're very good at being men, but they don't have any game. They don't know how to talk to women, right? So you kind of have to develop a different kind of sense. And I think in a way that means giving up a little bit of your identity. It means like, oh, I'm going to develop myself in a way that I'm unfamiliar with, that's in relation to someone else who's different than I am, which means I might have to sit through a conversation that I don't find immediately interesting. Or I might have to recognize that her and I have different ways of talking and that this isn't actually a bad thing. There are a lot of those types of insights that people need to be slightly guided to overcome these differences. Because guess what? Cultural difference, what does it feel like? It's like, ooh, this person doesn't understand me. How could this possibly be the one? This one doesn't understand me. It's like, well, you actually have a cultural difference. How do you bridge the gap? Like women don't really want to talk about crypto all the time. Okay, so like, what are you going to talk about? You know? So I guess that's a kind of loopy answer, but get off the dating apps and meet people in person. And if you're not meeting people in person, make a Twitter account and start talking to people on Twitter. It's one of the best ways that I found that people have been meeting people. Make content, show yourself in the world. Like that's what game is, that's what flirtation is. It's showing yourself, and show the things about yourself that you find the most interesting, and show that you're interested in somebody reaching out to you, and maybe it'll happen.
All right, thanks, Brandon. Let's move to Kevin. Kevin.
Hey, what's up, everybody?
Yo, Kevin, what's up?
Hey, Raven. Good talk.
Thanks.
Let's see. What is it? Let me roll up. All right. So you mentioned a couple, bullet items that might make the ideal relationship partner: your adventure buddy, your career partner, your best friend, the best sex you've ever had, being a good parent. Do you think we have to have it all? Like, are we supposed to cultivate all of these inside of ourselves and then find someone who cultivates all these? Like, and how do we choose what to prioritize from our partner? And some people in the chat, we've been going back and forth about polyamory, and I wonder what, what do you think about this? How to approach looking for someone that has all these traits and cultivating them within yourself and the other thing.
Okay, well, I think this has to do with like basically what echelon you're in. So that's the other thing about dating, is that it is, it's terribly unequal, especially the dating situation we're in now. Because women basically want to be with men who have game, right? And a lot of men don't have game, okay? And basically what this does is it means there's a small group of men who do have game, who basically get all the women, right? If you're in that situation, you're kind of in a totally different decision matrix. And this is kind of where I was thinking about female virtue. And I think polyamory comes into this as well, because if you have think about the proportions. If you have 20% males who are being selected for, and you have 80% of women who are involved with those guys, do the math. There are multiple people with multiple people in this situation. There's no way to get around that. And what we're seeing is a stratification, essentially, where there are women who are highly desirable. They have multiple men who are trying to get their affections. That means that those women have a lot of bargaining power, and they don't have to commit. They don't have to commit because they have a lot of options, right? And so if you're in that position, if that's the echelon that you're in, if that's what your situation is, then you can be picky, right? And that's, or at least that's the idea, is that you can be picky. And I think that's where the whole list comes in, where you're oh, I need a man who's like this, like this, like this, who could I get? Maybe he'd be a little bit better than this guy. Before I'm going to shut down all of my options, I want to make sure that I can get the very best for myself. I think there's something really kind of toxic about this mentality, but it's pretty unconscious. I don't think that most people are really thinking explicitly in this way. But it is kind of a structural effect of this dynamic of just having a lot of people wanting your attention, and then being able to choose or not choose and still get the kind of attention that you want. So in terms of finding, I think ultimately, if you are an attractive person and you have options, then you can start to begin to look for things is this person developing themselves and their character? Are they individuating? Are they embodied? Are they interested in changing and developing in the relationship with you? But that's something that kind of only becomes possible when you're at a different level of choice. And a lot of that does have to do with you, right? If you're a good man and you have no game, you get some game and suddenly you're leaps ahead of other people. So I think basically you have to do a pretty ruthless self-evaluation of how desirable you are, and then think from there and be brave enough to develop the qualities that you think somebody would find attractive. I think that we do need to be a little bit less picky, though. I think the whole idea of the complete picture with the other is pretty overly romantic, and that people should try and make friends. that they can also depend on in the long-term way. That's another thing. Yeah, go ahead.
Can I ask you to unpack this term that you threw out a couple times? Oh,
Yeah.
Marco just said it. Yeah, game. How would you?
Oh, game.
Or
Okay.
even Connolly, what's your definition of game?
Okay, what's my definition of game? Okay, game is this kind of, what is game? Okay, I mean, I think
Good luck.
what game points to is this kind of interactivity. This something, it's like flirtation. It's like the capacity to come into an unknown situation and establish yourself really quickly in a way that's very charming. So like, somebody could have very nerdy game, or someone could have really comical game, or someone can have really suave and like sexy game, like there's different kinds of game. And different men kind of create different strategies basically, but it would be like like what's your mating dance? Like, how do you bring in, what's your bower look like? It's that type of, it's that place within mating. It's like, how do you bring someone in? And game, I think what it does for women, it's a signal of social capability, which is, women want that in a man. They want them to have an ability to talk to women and to understand them. It's a very important signal of whether or not that man is ever going to be able to understand you. If he can't even talk to you when you first meet, like, how are you supposed, like, why would you keep going when you don't know if he'll be able to even relate to you? So I think game becomes this important signal of a man's ability to kind of defer to the interest or the desires of a woman, and then also appeal to them to make her feel like she's known particularly, and her way of being is being recognized. I think that's what game does. Cool.
All right, thanks, Kevin. We are at the top of the hour. I think that means it's time to move on to Socratic speed dating. For everyone else who asked a question, I'm sorry we ran out of time. Hopefully Raven will come back for more series on these topics.
Yeah. I wish I could do more questions. Okay, did anyone have could I ask for a question about polyamory?
This is your event, Raven. Do what you want.
Okay. If anyone has a question, I would love to talk about this. If someone has a question about it that they want to bring up, you can just raise your hand if you want. If not, then we'll
about what? Can you clarify?
Polyamory.
Oh.
I know Kevin mentioned it, but Kevin, do you want to ask it?
Not really.
No, okay, you don't want to.
I don't have a question. I don't have any questions.
You just want to talk about, I mean, I think, okay, so I actually
that
think
was one of the solutions people in the chat brought up.
Oh, Ariel. Ariel, do you wanna say something?
Yeah, my video is not working.
That's totally fine.
Yeah, I guess just articulating a question. Do you think polyamory solves kind of this issue of like too much pickiness, like trying to find like the adventure partner and intellectual equal and best friend in one person, like that? Delegating it to more people kind of solves that problem.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that for some people it solves this problem. Yeah. There are obviously trade-offs. In a polyamorous structure, there is the confrontation of a lot of uncomfortable feelings, of jealousy or envy or insecurity. Like, obviously those are things that do come up in polyamorous relationships, but I think that it does serve that for the people who are engaged in these kinds of lifestyles, that they are recognizing that any given partner doesn't really completely fulfill all of these relationship expectations. And so there's a certain amount of kind of open recognition that everyone is in this situation of being incompletely satisfied by any given partner that they're with, which I think does solve certain problems and then maybe causes others. But were you going to say something?
It worked. Okay.
Oh, hi. Hello.
Hi. Yeah, I guess a follow-up question is like, one thing with polyamory that I sometimes wonder is like Jordan Peterson has a concept that like when we make a sacrifice, like what we're sacrificing for becomes more meaningful.
Yeah.
And I sometimes wonder like whether with polyamory, there's like, when we get that breath, if there's like a depth that isn't there that can be reached with monogamy.
I definitely think that like the work of Dunbar, I don't know if anyone knows about this, but he has just published a book called On Friendship, which has a really incredible model of thinking about basically how much capacity we have for certain types of relationships in our lives. And what he points out is that most people don't have any more than 5 very intimate relationships. And then you have like 15 that are kind of like close acquaintances, people that you're related to, and then it kind of grows from there up to the famous Dunbar number of 150. And I think what this does is basically kind of gives you a sense of there are limitations, right? Like, for example, introverts are more likely to invest in fewer deep relationships, whereas extroverts are more likely to, invest in like many but less deep relationships. And a lot of this has to do with basically the kind of relationships that extroverts versus introverts value. So I've been using that framework in terms of thinking about polyamory, that it's not so much that like one relationship needs to take all of the depth that you have, all of your depth capacity, but if you bring in too many, you do begin to sacrifice the depth of any given relationship. I think that the way I've been thinking about like dating, polyamory to monogamy is basically that polyamory seems to be a very kind of contingent period of relationship for some people, that you kind of move through this stage where before you have children. And then once you have children, you basically have to open up a bunch of your intimate slots for the new life that you're beginning to raise, right? like, sorry, I can't like sleep with all these people anymore, even if they're deep relationships. They have to basically you have to make room for your child and your next child. And that actually means that the pair bond becomes a much more practical arrangement for a period of time. So, I think what happens in a lot of polyamorous relationships is they're poly and they have a kid and they're more pair bonded. And then once the kids are grown, then they go back to being poly because the burden of those relationships shifts over time. So I think I think it's interesting to think about. I think polyamory is a good thing for some people. I think monogamy is a good thing for other people. And I guess that's kind of a broader point that I wanted to touch on that I missed, which is basically that I think in the condition that we're in now, there's no universal dating advice. Like there's nothing that anyone can say that's going to solve every single type of relational dynamic. Like you do really have to look at your own situation and what's possible for you and make your own choices based on your own values. So for some people, polyamory seems like the way, and for others, they want to have strict monogamous relationships. And I think that's highly contextual. Thanks for the question.
Raven, we can keep doing Q&A if you'd like. We could even take a vote to see would people prefer to continue Q&A or would they prefer to date, as they say.
Do they want to date or do they want a Q&A? Yeah, how about this? Why don't we do one breakout room? So basically what we're going to do for Socratic Speed Dating is throw you guys into groups and for 10 minutes and then talk. You guys get to talk one-on-one and then we'll come back and then why don't we do another Q&A? Maybe we can get to Evan. Or Evan, do you want to ask your question now? Let's just do
Evan.
Evan really wants to ask.
I really wanted to call on Evan, but I'm like, we're out of time. We gotta move on.
No. Okay, let's do it. We'll start the rounds later. That's fine.
Okay,
right,
so So my question, I guess,
Whoa,
I
Evan.
thought it would be worth asking because it didn't seem to get covered by the other questions. And this is basically surrounding ideas of androgyny, especially energetic androgyny. So, as many people here know, I come from a sort of tantric lineages where practice looks like, if you have a male body, integrating feminine energy and becoming sort of energetically androgynous, and flip that for if you have a female body, or etc. And so I'm wondering just what your thoughts are on this. Like, how does this relate to the sort of like fairly hard reification of the difference between masculine and feminine and male and female bodies, and all the kind of, basically, how does this relate to your thoughts on the topic, wherever you want to take that, was my question, because I'm sure you have interesting thoughts there.
Yeah, really appreciate this question. Okay, so I mean, I would say my thinking on this is still evolving. I would consider myself to be fairly androgynous as well. So there's some sort of like kind of tension that I feel as well when thinking about gender. But when it comes to androgyny, I think that I'm partial to kind of Alexander Bard's model around androgyny, which is basically that, he has this idea of the sociant, which is basically this kind of like primordial tribal world where there are the men and the women, and the women are of the inner circle and the men are of the outer circle, and between the inner and outer circle is the androgen. This is where like the kind of queer people would be, the gay people, the go-betweens, and they often act as translators between the masculine and the feminine, the male and the female languages. Because, and this is something I didn't get the chance to get into, but there are actually feminine and masculine languages. And this is a very common thing in traditional societies, that there are actually types of words and also ways of speaking that are gender segregated. So there are these two differences of speech and language and relational experience, way of being in the world, different tools that men and women use. And there's this like very small percentage of people in the tribe that work as go-betweens. These would often be like your priests or your priestesses, or people kind of in a special category that they're seen as not quite like the others. And then of course the shaman is outside of the community as a go-between between tribes. The shaman is just absolutely depraved, upside down character, right? So, I do like this model because what it does is it acknowledges that there are gender polarities, and that they fulfill certain kinds of almost structural position, that women in the center and men on the outside. It makes intuitive sense, right? That men would be the borders and the women would be the kind of heart or the center of the community. It makes intuitive sense. And it also makes sense that nature is kind of producing not merely people in the kind of, the first standard deviation, from the mean, but also these edge cases, these people who are kind of strangely intertwined between the masculine and the feminine principles. I think what I'm starting to question is like, I don't know, Keegan has this little quip about, if you like go from like second to third like consciousness in like 3 days, like you ain't done it. Like these things take time. And so I think that there's something about like just pushing forth into androgyny, especially like with kids, or like with people just kind of electing that they're androgynous, or thinking that androgyny is better than being of any given kind of gender, where I feel like culturally or in the kind of like social space, we haven't quite figured out how to both value gender and like femininity and the total expression of femininity, like women who are women, right, and men who are men, and like have a place of honor for those things, without trying to be like, oh, you actually need to become androgynous, like that's the higher power. I think that I have a little bit of a bone to pick with that. I'm not sure what it is exactly, but Yeah, I guess it as like a kind of totalizing value where everybody needs to try and become the other at the expense of being what they are is like the potential mistake that people are making. Not necessarily the way it is when it's ideal. Yeah, does that make sense? Or do you have a follow-up?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a follow-up question per se, but a thought that occurs to me, especially as you were, answering the question towards the end, is that, I wonder the tantric traditions make a lot of sense back when, in some semi-mythological age when, well, men were men, women were women. And so the prescription to integrate the aspects of the other gender made sense because there wasn't this sense of instability in like whatever you currently are. And so that might be the direction of growth or something like that. But yeah, so lots to think about. Thank you.
Yeah. And I think this once again goes back into like, you have to think about where you are and what you're related to. Like, even if there's only like 10% of the globe that is the androgynous category, that's a lot of people, 8 billion people, right? So like, you have to know where you are, and make sure that when you're hearing advice or you're hearing people talk about things people ought to do, that you are understanding whether or not you're that person or they're talking to somebody else. That's just good, good advice hygiene. Yeah, okay, so that was a great question. Thank you so much. I think now we will go into the Socratic speed dating. The first question that we're going to do is really simple and open-ended, which is basically like, what is, and we'll put it in the chat too, but what was like the biggest surprise or the most kind of interesting thought that came to you when you were listening to the presentation and the questions? So just bringing forth the thing that's most alive for you in response to the presentation. So that'll be the first question, and I'll send it out to you when you're in your breakout rooms.
To be clear, everyone's going to move to a breakout room right now. It's going to be pairs, so you'll be paired with one other person. Raven, how long do you want to give them to talk?
We have 10 minutes, so just to be conscientious and divide it up at least kind of 5 minutes each. It can be back and forth, but give everybody some time to talk.
Okay. And let's see, let me switch these around a little bit real quick. I'm sure some people will drop off at this point because they always do. If for some reason your room doesn't have another person in it, you can always come back to the main room and talk to myself or Raven. Okay, cool. Here we go.